I'm going to record it. There we
And I
go.
need my notes.
Should I start over again?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Nemitz.
And I'm Sarah Sawyer.
Welcome to this evening's Learning Differences Support Group conversation. This week is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and there are a number of online informational events that you should definitely check out. Go to neurodiversityweek.com to learn more.
Our guest tonight is neurodiversity advocate Aaryan Shah. Aaryan is the founder of Unitopia, a foundation based right here in the Bay Area that was founded by high school students to support young people with learning differences. Unitopia now has chapters all over the world. Aaryan also hosts a really cool podcast called Neurodiversity in a Nutshell, which can be found on Apple Podcasts. The podcast, which started in 2020, has many episodes covering topics from autism, dyslexia, and ADHD, and other neurodiverse conditions, but also addresses self-advocacy, allyship, policy issues. And there's even an episode where he interviewed, coming full circle, to founder of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, Sienna Castellan.
Tonight, Aaryan will discuss how to be an ally. He will describe his journey and how he came to be an advocate for the neurodiverse community. Special thanks to our own Elodie, who is involved with Unitopia and made tonight's guest possible. Please welcome Aaryan Shah. Hello, Aaryan.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for the introduction, Greg and Sarah. I really appreciate it. Yeah, do I have the opportunity to screen share by any chance?
Sure, let me make that move for you. Oh, I gotta let some more people in.
Awesome.
There we go. We have a few more guests, and let's see, how do we do this? No, that's to share the screen.
I sent everyone a reminder, Greg, on that thread.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully more people will jump in, because I know a couple of people mentioned they were coming and are really excited.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, I hope so. I have to switch over the hosting. So how do I do that? Do you know how to do that?
Gael is here.
Gael, how do I switch over the hosting?
Yeah. You just need to go to the participant list
Mhm.
and just click on Aaryan's name. There's should be 3 little dots, and then it should be make co-host. Should be one of the options.
Invite or make co-host?
No, participants are there.
It's the participant list. You can click probably on the bottom of your computer screen, and then the sidebar will show up on the side.
Ah, okay, I got
Aha.
it. You can see
More.
and make host. You're the host.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, I think I have it. Let me accept a couple of people from the waiting room, or will you guys be able to do that?
No, I think you have to do that.
Okay,
Maybe
I'll
you're the host.
do that as well. Cool. Yeah. Okay, let me screen share. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Looks
Okay,
great.
perfect. So yeah, thank you for the amazing introduction once again. My name is Aaryan. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Unitopia. I'm going to just be spending a lot of time talking about, I guess, my journey, starting with a brief introduction about myself, going on into some focus points about neurodiversity. I think this group is kind of well versed in the subject, so I'll kind of skip through it a little bit. But I'll just kind of cover some of the basics and tell a personal anecdote, and then go into what effective allyship looks like. And then finally, a Q&A. So hopefully that sounds good. Let's get right into it. So first off, as an introduction, so Greg and Sarah covered a lot of the basic details, but I'm a senior at Irvington High School in Fremont, California. I'm 3 months from graduating, so almost headed to college. Like you guys said, I'm the founder of Unitopia, which is a small student-run nonprofit organization based in the Bay Area now that has grown international. We work all over the world with a lot of special, full inclusion schools, special needs schools, a lot of different environments to promote inclusion and take steps towards neurodiversity, especially in areas where some of these kind of concepts really haven't been extensively developed and brought up forward yet. One of our major advocacy and education efforts has been through our podcast, which is Neurodiversity in a Nutshell. We cover a wide breadth of topics regarding neurodiversity, which has been a really fun journey, bringing new people on that are interested in editing, writing scripts, and things like that. And lastly, even just on a small scale, at my school, I'm the education specialist at our neurodiversity club. So I focus on just teaching neurotypical and neurodivergent students about simple concepts like models of disability that I'll be, spending a little bit of time today as well. So I'm going to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about Unitopia really quickly. Our current impact is, in my eyes, I believe is quite large, with over 1,200 families worldwide, with more than 3,000 volunteer hours, probably way more now, and more than 250 individualized sessions and even group sessions. So it's been a really long journey since we started in 2018. And I kind of just want to break down our timeline, which has been quite a lengthy one. And I think the biggest question that I often get asked is, as a neurotypical student, how did you get involved, right? What was your journey through disability advocacy? What did that look like? And it's actually a very, coincidental by chance type moment. In first grade, I was raised by a single mother, and actually during early Father's Day celebrations, I was sent to the resource classroom because I was considered out of place in the general education classroom, and I was sent to the resource classroom, which is pretty much the hallmark of all special education curriculum. And that's when I first met my cohort of special education students that became some of my closest friends throughout elementary school. And I used to go there for lunch, recess, and pretty much throughout. And I've continued that on since elementary school. In 2017 is when there were like peer tutoring electives available. And that's when I started at my local middle school, Horner, which is what it's called, and started shadowing teachers in classrooms. And soon after is when we actually started Unitopia. We had a group of peer tutors that decided, let's take some initiative and let's make this something beyond just our school. And that's when we started growing neurodiversity in a nutshell. We started working with the local neurodiversity club on campus, and we even developed into training and curriculum development for teachers, caregivers, and things like that. Personally, I took even further steps. I started working at San Francisco State with Dr. Pamela Wolfberg and some of her postdoctorates on integrated playgroups for autistic students. So I've been blessed with the opportunity to do clinical research as well in the field, which has been a really fun experience. So I have a lot of experience in terms of the clinical aspects as well as just the social interaction, which is something I really enjoy. And in terms of what Unitopia provides, if any parents are ever interested or want to learn more about the organization, we started off really with personalized interaction. This is what our first goal was. We started with just one-on-one sessions. This was me 4 years ago. I laugh at this picture because this was a very long time ago at a social event where we were all playing different sports games, indoor and outdoor field day, at one of our partners' events. And it was a pretty fun experience. And that's kind of what catalyzed Unitopia's journey. And we would have like 7 to 8 monthly sessions with each student. So for example, we had 5 volunteers to start off, and we would meet with 10 kids total every month. And we would do 2 times a week for each student for around 30 minutes to an hour, depending on their comfortability. We would talk to parents about each of their needs. For example, Uskari, who was my first student, I'll actually talk about him in a little bit. He would play video games for close to 13 hours a day. So his parents told me, hey, we want him to, come outside a little bit more. So our first goal was to, play soccer with him outside. And it took, I think, close to 3 months for me to even have a conversation with him to start off. But those formative 7 to 8 meetings every month really contributed to that process. And now I'm really happy to say that we've had, a lot of more local families, but also a lot of international impact, with translators and caregivers and everybody involved in the process. The next thing that we kind of incorporated was online activities during the pandemic. So we started providing free arts and crafts programs with free deliveries and just basically providing resources and things like that. These were our first kits that we used to give out. We had our first activity was clay roses. So we used to give out these small packets with all of the materials provided. So you could just work on those at home over Zoom with us. And yeah, we had like a pretty large impact there. And then we also provided some dance programs, which were easy to use, understandable, and really accessible based on students' abilities or impairments. And then kind of like the last thing that we started talking about was our podcast, Educational Awareness. This one, as you can see, was our cover art for one of our reports about the state of special education, where we gathered pretty much a lot of resources and kind of summarized what special education lacks and what are kind of like some of the issues with funding, staff, curriculum, and things like that. We focused on a lot of different issues. Some of them I'll be talking about today, like ableism and neurodiversity. We very much started as an inclusion-focused organization where we were just trying to focus on inclusion, but we definitely took a step further in the past couple of years talking about neurodiversity and things like that. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background. I know that's quite a bit, but I do want to talk about allyship in just a little bit. So yeah, that just provides kind of like some background about Unitopia as a whole, what my organization represents more than what I have done, which is what I like to think about as well. Okay. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about neurodiversity, and I'm going to start off with a personal anecdote. This is Uskari, my first student. Again, I was much younger in this picture, as you can probably tell. Very, very young, as well as Uskari. Uskari's my age, so we've definitely grown together since elementary school. He was actually one of the first students I met in elementary school. And like I said, he and I actually didn't talk properly for the first 2 months. And his first words to me were, do you want to watch me play video games? That was it. And for close to a month, all I did actually was sit on his bed and watch him play video games. And that's how I got to know him. I saw just the way that he would do it. And personally, I'm telling you, I am terrified to play video games. I like when the sound of like the shot happens, I drop the remote. I can't do it. And I would explain to him like, hey, like I'm just gonna have fun watching you because that's what I really enjoyed. And slowly he even started to recognize that, hey, I think I want to spend time outside, something both of us can do. And over the past few months and even years, we've actually spent a lot more time outside, and he's really enjoyed playing soccer and things like that. Obviously that's been hindered a little bit by the pandemic, but slowly and surely we have been spending a lot more time together. And I think these are just kind of like the smaller interactions that are really important to consider within inclusion and neurodiversity, without getting kind of lost in the big picture of training and things like that, because these interactions are the ones I hold most near and dear to my heart as an ally. And I think that's something that's super important to remember, that even though you're an ally, it's always important to put, the neurodivergent individual first, rather than trying to speak for them in terms of whatever their goal is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. But yeah, so before I get into like the list of kind of like common neurodivergent conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, I do want to say that these are kind of just some of the more commonly seen ones. And what the basic difference is between neurodiversity and I guess, the medical definitions of what a disability is that the medical diagnosis holds like importance for, educational context, for, setting what they kind of need. But there's a lot of social implications of these neurodivergent conditions that kind of go unconsidered, as well as the fact that neurodiversity, I mean, if you break it down, it really means that every person's brain functions differently, right? And what that basically indicates is that even though we have these categorizations of this is what autism is, this is what ADHD is, every person has their own preferences and views about all of these concerns. So one question that I often get, especially from people that are unfamiliar with inclusion and neurodiversity, is there like an exhaustive list, right, of neurodivergent conditions? Like what is considered neurodivergent? And I think a lot of people take the view that everybody technically is neurodivergent because the way we approach, let's say, a complex, mathematical problem is different, on a person-to-person basis, right? Everybody's brain functions differently. But I think what it's really important to consider is that gatekeeping has been an issue with a lot of these social movements. If you even look at things like the LGBTQ+ movement, there was a lot of room for discussion for identity and preventing what people consider queer, or what people consider disabled, or what people consider neurodiverse. So these variations is the reason why we don't have some exhaustive list. So I'm just going to cover 3 basic ones. The first being autism spectrum condition. A lot of people call this ASD. Dr. Pamela Wolfberg taught me, at least, that it's called ASC because condition is more value neutral in terms of the way that it's used, because condition can be good condition or bad condition, versus disorder implies that there is a direct negative connotation to the word. So according to the DSM-5, with the diagnostic statistical manual that's used by most psychiatrists to diagnose these conditions, the 2 basic kind of like things, there's a bunch of subpoints under it, but repetitive and restrictive behaviors, some people can call this stimming or fidgeting, for example, or that there's certain, differences in social interaction and communication. But based on our research as an organization and what we've looked at, we've seen that there's a growing need for inclusion and a strengths-based focus. And this is something that I saw with Uskari as well, that, his memory was was as developed as mine. And you could see that there were a lot of strengths that we could recognize in the process, preference for logical thinking, more accuracy and attention to detail and things like that. And that was a very common theme that we saw in general. For conditions like ADHD, the research has extensively shown that people view hyperactivity and maybe hyperfocus or hyperfixation as a bad thing, but there's also the stamina and perseverance that comes with it. So I think there's been an extensive focus on the disability, on the deficit, but there's a huge difference with the difference versus deficit model. And what I've learned, especially with my experiences, is that it's honestly not even difference versus deficit, it's also strengths versus deficit, because there's a lot of strengths that can come along with many of these conditions. So yeah, that's a tidbit on ADHD. And then lastly, dyslexia and dyscalculia, I put on the same slide because they're actually really interesting in regards that they're kind of opposites in what researchers see, in that there's learning challenges for literary and mathematical concepts, respectively. But what dyslexic students often have are like big picture and verbal recognition and logical thinking, versus dyscalculic students present, a strengths in verbal understanding and literary ability, which is really interesting about how they're kind of opposites in some regard. So yeah, those are just a couple of examples of some conditions. I'm sure like this group of folks already kind of knows a little bit about these, but I just wanted to provide kind of like a coverage of them. Yeah, and I guess this kind of gets summarized into two basic models of disability that are commonly categorized by neurodiversity philosophers. That the social model is basically something that can be changed in the environment to basically comfort somebody with a condition or a difference, basically societal kind of claims. So for example, if a world was made for people that are 4 feet tall, then obviously somebody that's 8 foot tall would not fit in that world. But if the world were made for people that were 8 foot tall, that 8 foot tall person would definitely feel comfortable, right? So it's that change in environment that should be, looked at rather than something related to the person themselves. And the medical model is kind of something that can be looked at, that the condition is something that can be changed individually. And this is something that a lot of organizations hold, that, oh, we should be searching for a cure for some of these conditions, which kind of is, in my eyes, not necessarily acceptable in terms of like the viewpoint in terms of neurodiversity, because we all have our own differences. But yeah, those are the basic principles. Yeah. So a lot of people ask, like, what are some like neurodiversity-centric practices that are being used in the current world today? I think there's a couple of cool ones. The Rising Tide Car Wash is actually personally my favorite. They specifically employ neurodivergent individuals because of their attention to detail. And this is one of these examples of like capitalizing on strengths specifically, rather than just like, oh, this student is different, it'd be better for our PR, right? Because I think a lot of companies have started to adopt that. Like, oh, this would be like really cool for our public relations campaign if we hired, 3 neurodivergent folks just as tokens to represent our company and show that, oh, we do hire. But the Rising Tide Car Wash specifically, states that, oh, they actually do a better job than somebody else would. And that's why we're taking them. It's based on their abilities. It's based on their merit. It's the same thing with a lot of these tech companies. They're specifically placed in pattern detection or cybersecurity teams or divisions that, rely on like attention to detail. The Australian Defense and Israeli Defense Forces actually hire students with autism for pattern detection and cybersecurity. So those are just a couple of examples of neurodiversity-centric practices that can be implemented on like a professional level as well. Yeah. So kind of covering today what I guess I'm supposed to come here for is effective allyship. So I think the biggest question is why, and I think it's can be easy to answer, but I think there's a very interesting statistic about the diagnoses rising of a lot of these neurodivergent conditions. There's been a loosening of the diagnostic criteria. So what psychiatrists identified as what autism was in DSM-4, the previous edition, versus DSM-5, it's a much more broader definition. of what autism was. Autism specifically has become autism spectrum rather than just autism, and Asperger and NDDs is what they used to be categorized as. So 3 different ones. Now it's just a wide variety of a spectrum. Oh, me, except people from the waiting room. Okay, yeah. And then I think this is totaled now, like across all what people would consider traditionally called disabilities, to approximately 1.5 billion people worldwide, which is a very large proportion of our population across the globe. And I think one thing that has really come out in the research recently is that allyship is beneficial for everyone. It's not something that's limited to, oh, like this is going to help, neurodivergent populations in their pursuits. It's also something that helps, neurotypical individuals. It's definitely helped me personally in terms of my self-growth and my maturity. And it's definitely helps in terms of mentorship, teaching skills, and things like that. So yeah, that's, I think, the major reason why. And I think as these diagnoses keep rising, as people start recognizing the importance of allyship in really any fields, whether it's, about disability or inclusion, or even when it comes to gender or racial, or like ethnicities, it's something that we really should consider. So I like to categorize it into 3 major components. These are not by any means linear. It's just what I like to explain to our volunteers, especially neurotypical volunteers when they come on. There's 3 kind of major ones that are really important: language, recognition, and representation. So language is pretty simple. I think people undervalue how important this is, and they think, oh, if I have the right intentions, it's completely fine. But it definitely does make a difference how you speak about how you respond to rhetoric around a specific subject. In our autism training guide for our caregivers and teachers, we have a specific section designated to what proper rhetoric should look like. And obviously, there's a lot of different terms that can be used. Neurodivergent and I guess neurominority is a common word used for like individuals with cognitive differences, versus neurotypical and neuromajority, which is for what people would consider traditionally being called normally functioning cognition. And I think the Stanford Neurodiversity Project spends some time that kind of draws it as like a bell curve, that people in like the 95% confidence interval are considered the neuromajority, or what neurotypicals are, and the 5% on the tails end are what we would consider the neurominority. So there's a lot of different, philosophical approaches to categorizing what these are, but the general idea is that we should be using the appropriate language for what these things are. Some people like to, for example, for autism, some people like using the word like autistic people versus people with autism. The identity first versus person first language also matters. And while there is really no consensus on what people prefer, it's something that's up to the individual. So those types of questions of language and rhetoric are always really important, and something that really is something very important to consider in movements towards allyship, because these words matter to the populations that we are trying to support, and we should embody our best in that. But at the same time, language doesn't go far enough. You can't necessarily just use the right words and then on the flip side be, not really advocating for them just because you're using the right language. And I guess like just showboating that you're doing the right thing without actually doing the right thing, which is why I like to spend a lot of time for recognition and really understanding the signs. I think a lot of parents usually understand like the major signs of common conditions like ADHD and autism. I know my parents, I have a 5-year-old brother, and he struggles to focus sometimes. And my parents are always like, oh yeah, like, if this persists, like we should definitely, get this checked out and things like that. But, it's something that we should always kind of make sure of. But what's also really cool is that resources like books and podcasts have always been available about educational ableism, disability law and policy, and really important concepts. What's really nice about like disability law is that there's really only 3 laws to really understand concretely. It's not that long of a list. Which I guess you could also say kind of really sucks because there hasn't been that much progress made in the past few decades. But if you really want to get a firm understanding of what, the potential policies and laws are in terms of, free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environments and all of those terminologies, it's really easy to understand and track. I know there's a lot of credentials that you can pursue for like $1,500 all over online to become professionally licensed. But if you really just want to grasp that basic understanding, there isn't that much of a disparity between that professional credential and just having a basic understanding of what these terms are. And I've learned that if you just have basic conversations with teachers, they can also just explain to you what educational ableism looks like in a classroom context. And they can even give you examples of what that sounds like. So I think there's a lot of resources available. I would highly recommend, this is a little bit of self-promotion, but I would highly recommend checking out our podcast. I do think we cover a lot of important topics. Recently, we've been doing a lot more interviews as well, which have been amazing opportunities to talk to researchers. Like you guys talked about Sienna Castellan, who's the founder of Neurodiversity Celebration Week. She's been an amazing resource for us in terms of guiding how we approach our efforts towards inclusion and things like that. And lastly, I think in terms of recognition is respecting individual experiences. Like I mentioned, when it comes to language especially, there's a lot of things about personal views. Some people like to really claim their identity. They believe that their condition is a part of them, versus some people like to kind of dissociate their identity from their condition. And that's really a personal experience that we have to respect no matter what. Continuing on recognition, once again, appreciating personal narratives and experiences. This extends past language. It can also be about the potential for disability laws and policies. For example, one nice example that I like to think about is Autism Speaks, which is this major organization that supports or claims to support autistic individuals. Now, a lot of neurotypical individuals will see an autistic, like advocacy organization, and they say, "Oh, cool, like that's probably the best way to go." But the truth about Autism Speaks is that it was founded by a couple of grandparents who had a grandchild with autism, and they wanted to do whatever they could to cure the condition because they thought it was that much of a deficit, right? Yet some people believe, especially autistic students themselves, believe that it's still an amazing organization. They still, at the end of the day, they have millions in funding, and even though only 5% goes towards occupational therapist or changes in the social environment, that 5% is still millions of dollars, right? Even if 95% of that funding goes towards researching a cure, right? Whereas some people completely disagree, and some neurodivergent folk prefer the idea of self-advocacy networks. There's one really famous one that's called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, that's run by Aaryan Shah, that focuses, like every board member is neurodivergent, a lot of representation. So again, like a lot of different experiences and views, and it's something that we should always kind of consider. Something that I like to do in like all of my talks is I think I do this intentionally, but I always make sure to always say that I don't represent any of these views holistically. I think I have some personal opinions maybe, but they're never really concrete because I never know the future interaction I may have that will change my thought process. So whenever I see, like, oh, researchers say this, or, there is an organization and some other people say this. And I think that's really important as an ally because I don't think our views are necessarily as, representative of a thought process as an autistic or an autistic individual or somebody with ADHD would prefer. And then also one big thing is like really recognizing accessibility, using high contrast in like presentations and things like that, just to make it easier for people with like visual impairments or hearing impairments. Something that we try to do on our podcast is provide transcripts so that it's accessible for anybody to read and things like that. If I don't know if any of you potentially run a restaurant, Braille menus, things like that, and having those options for, let's say, even like sign language, and then multimedia learning. This has come out recently in like literature for teachers to provide a bunch of different resources in the way that they learn. So provide presentations, provide lectures, provide interviews, but also provide, paper texts and things like that, or books to read, or, things that can be digested in different ways for people that prefer to learn differently. And I could go into like a whole another 30-minute talk about multimodal learning for sure. And I would love to come back and discuss that more, especially with different conversations about something like how they can be used ineffectively and how they can be used inappropriately sometimes. But I will leave it at that for now. But I would definitely say when used appropriately, they can be quite effective. And I think the biggest thing is that with internet resources, there's kind of sometimes a doubt of really trusting what's what, trusting the information. I would always say that there's qualified individuals that are definitely going to be out there, especially in like the medical field, that can definitely explain, conditions and disabilities really effectively, and make sure to do research from reputable sources. Obviously, the best way to get information is speaking directly to somebody, speaking directly to neurodivergent individuals, and really recognizing that there is an issue and you can do something about it, even if you're neurotypical. I think that was kind of what really put me into action, was the idea that a lot of people feel that, oh, like I can't really necessarily support anything beyond maybe donating to an organization. But there really is a lot that you can do. I feel like even this conversation is something that I can contribute. And I think that recognizing that you can, and you maybe even have a responsibility to do so, is a really nice thing that can hold a lot of weight and importance. Okay, this is, I think, the last slide I have today, and I think this is super important, probably the most important slide is representation. We've seen a lot more representation of neurodivergent folks everywhere. I like to think of everywhere, not nearly enough, considering that the population is around 10% of, across the world, but we're hopefully going to get there soon. We still have unemployment rates north of 85%. For neurodivergent individuals. So, there's still quite a lot of gaps that need to be fixed, even educationally, professionally, etc. But there's a lot of places where neurodivergent students and parents and, anybody can be involved, whether that's decision-making processes. I know a bunch of school site councils, which are district groups that make decisions on campuses. They often have special education teachers involved, and they try to even have, special ed parents involved in making decisions to consider accessibility and things like that. Job opportunities, like I mentioned, like the Rising Tide Car Wash, Specialistern, Microsoft, SAP, they've also set like specific goals to like make sure that representation is reaching where it should be. Thoughtful discussions, even like just like roundtable discussions, should probably like incorporate a lot of voices directly. I know a lot of universities that do panels, like just discussion panels often have neurodivergent voices there. And that's just a really good example of incorporating those voices. This one holds like near and dear to my heart because I've been working on this on campus. But DEI initiatives is diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives often lack consideration of inclusion for disabilities and neurodiversity, which is really frustrating. And if you do like even a quick Google search of why do I think I was searching this up a couple of days ago, and I searched up why does DEI not include disability, and everybody's just asking the same question, like, isn't this something that should be considered like within race, culture, gender, etc. It's exactly true. Like that's something that we really should be enforcing and bolstering in our local communities. So whether that's in a workplace or even just on campus, DEI shouldn't be just restricted to 1 week in March. It should be something that's year round. In the same way that Black History Month shouldn't be restricted to just February, it should be a year round thing. And then lastly, this is something that Unitopia has been working on, is employment trainings, and trying to help teachers understand the plight of ableism and how that kind of operates, how least restrictive environments still aren't least restrictive somehow, even though we've seen there have been trying efforts towards it, but not necessarily as effective as possible. And those are just some mechanisms for representation. And what we've actually seen recently is that there's been quite a few state assembly members and people like that. I think one in Pennsylvania that are openly neurodivergent, and they love talking about it. A lot of even politicians have children that are on the spectrum or things like that have bolstered efforts towards disability advocacy. But those are just important steps towards representation as well. So yeah, I think that summarizes my presentation. I've left my email here, 2 emails that you can reach out to. If you're looking for more resources, I could send you a bunch of them if you just respond to them. If you check them out individually, once I stop screen sharing, I'll put them in the chat as well. So you can just copy paste it. If you're looking for more resources, feel free to reach out to me. I can, we can have a conversation. We can have another meeting. I'm okay with anything. I would love to talk. And if you want to be directly involved with our organization, you can contact the second email so that all of the inquiries will go to the organization and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. But yeah, I would love to answer any questions or any kind of concerns, anything of the kind. Yeah.
Anyone has a question, you're still the host there, Aaryan.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
you can see if people raise their hand or if they want to ask anything. I think one question that I would have for you is, when I first went to your site, it wasn't clear to me that you're a Bay Area organization. It looked like, wow, you're a global organization. So you definitely have done a good job of making yourself seem, really larger than you are. How do you get the various chapters in other geographical areas to focus? Because as you've shown, the topics are so broad. How do you kind of point them in a direction so that they don't get kind of lost in the many areas that you can go into?
Yeah, so for our chapter development, I mean, I can start with just explaining how we usually separate the kind of different concepts, but we usually have 3 different types of chapters. One is resource development chapters. Second option is like assistive technology chapters. And then the third one is awareness chapters. So each one is kind of like a different focal point in terms of what they want to focus on. Some of them are focusing on resource development. So let's say our friends in, let's say like Kenya, for example, they focus on resource development. So they help us try to like implement some of the tools that we like help create in terms of like our training guides, actually handing them to caregivers and teachers directly and saying, here is a handbook on what you can do. Here's what you can learn. Let's try to implement some of these ideas. And that's where kind of multimodal learning kind of comes into play. But I guess overall, the simple kind of question that it kind of comes down to is, how do we get from full special needs schools all the way to neurodiversity? Because it's a very large gap. And I think the way that I like to break it down is inclusion first, neurodiversity second, right? The first way to kind of explain neurodiversity is for people to even have the experiences with neurodivergent students in the first place, right? So, incorporating co-teaching classrooms. There have been multiple studies, I think in Greece, University of North Macedonia or something of the kind. There are a couple of studies there that showed that co-teaching classrooms have like exemplary results in terms of how neurotypical students learn and how neurodivergent students learn. And also, just for reference, co-teaching classrooms are when you have a cohort of general ed students, so neurotypical students, and a few neurodivergent students, and you have one general ed teacher and a special ed teacher, and they're all together. And there have been a lot of exemplary results there. So that's kind of like a very inclusive setting that people are not necessarily used to. So our first effort is just trying to create those types of environments, whether it's directly a classroom or if it's even just on the playground. Having those types of interactions exposes people to, oh, like, wait, this isn't necessarily a deficit. Like, there's no, like, I didn't even notice. Like what are we talking about here? Then we can start, people start acquainting people with the idea of, oh, okay, maybe we can start moving to neurodiversity, of like explaining how to capitalize on those strengths that we're talking about, right? Like, how can we focus multimodal learning into, oh, maybe we should be using, mathematical concepts to explain things because they're stronger at logical thinking. One of the mathematical interventions that we talk about in our training guide is CRA, concrete representational abstract methods of teaching. And some of those work better than others, and properly teaching those to teachers is kind of like the first step to making sure that we are able to make progress. But it's definitely like a 2-step process, if that makes sense.
Any more questions?
Yeah,
I have a question. Oh, you can go first.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask, I know that you're doing some podcasting work with our students, and I was just curious about some of the work that you are doing in, schools around the Bay Area. Just trying to understand, how else we could work with you or how other schools work with you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually having a lot of fun with that. Thank you to Elodie for setting those up. It's been really fun. I actually had a session earlier today. So for
they love
Yeah.
it, and they want to help other kids. They are looking into be part of Unitopia also. So.
Yeah. So their first question was, can we volunteer? So I was actually pretty excited for that. For EB at least, I've just been teaching how to like simply make a podcast. I don't think it needs to be something, you know, neurodiversity related. I would love for it to be, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be, I think what would be really interesting to hear is just life at a bilingual school. And I think that's what they were gravitating towards in terms of what they wanted to cover. And then, you know, spend a little bit of time this week talking about Neurodiversity Celebration Week. But in general, for some of the schools that we have been working with recently, a lot of it is like the one-on-one interaction that I mentioned. We coordinate with special ed departments and special education. Yeah, I guess departments is the best word. Departments to coordinate like one-on-one interactions. Recently, we're kind of starting up dance classes with certain school districts. So we can kind of have volunteers at that same school coordinate with the special education departments. So it's easier to coordinate rather than holding something on the weekend. And especially with Zoom fatigue and stuff, it can kind of be exhausting. Same thing with the arts and crafts activities. It has been harder to coordinate with Fremont, my local district, I'll be very honest. It's usually very easy to do it with other areas. Pleasanton is a very good example of, and San Jose have been pretty nice to us, but Fremont has been a little bit more difficult for some reason. I don't know exactly why, but it has been a little bit more difficult there. But something that we are trying to dip our toes in is teacher training as well. So one of our advisors from SFSU was also a part-time teacher in the Fremont School District, and he was trying to encourage general ed teachers to take a couple of, you know, seminars that were taught by us or like lectures created by us to kind of cover some of the information that I covered today. Oh yeah, I guess one last thing that I could talk about under that umbrella is, so for example, in Fremont, there's a mandatory elective called health that we're required to take that covers sexual and reproductive health and, you know, nutrition and stuff like that. I thought that it would be really cool if we could integrate neurodiversity and disability related curriculum. So that's kind of in the works, I suppose, of trying to incorporate one unit about what are some common conditions. But that would also be a very two-step process of explaining inclusion first and then going to neurodiversity. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I have a question. Oh,
No, you go first.
okay. Aaryan, thank you so much. Your work is so important, and I thank you. I love the piece about language and identity and how it's not finite, how it evolves. I come from being Hispanic, Latino, now Latinx, and I welcome it all, and we all have to adapt. And I really appreciate that. I wanted to ask you, since you work with a lot of kids, is what have kids told you that they wish that grown-ups knew, that their grown-ups knew about? What are their wants? I think that the connection you have with them is so special because you're their peer, right? So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I like that question because it's very true that the relationship that I have with a lot of students is very different from that of, their relationship with, let's say, their occupational therapist that they meet once a week. Just because naturally it's a very friendship-based conversation rather than like a I'm here to help you type conversation. And I think that I like to think of it, or what some people call a savior complex. And I think sometimes people view that. And I think that's actually what people say that they don't like the most, is all of the visits from people that they don't know. And sometimes that can be overwhelming in a lot of different ways. I think it's really nice that some students, especially Oscar, for example, he often tells me that he likes to be like, he just wants to like really connect with people, not in like a forced setting. And I think that's been like huge for him, that whenever we talk, it's always, it's literally in an outdoor setting, right? Like it's in not confined, and it's on purpose in that regard. But some of the times when he has to meet with speech therapists or occupational therapists, he feels like, oh, this is like 1 hour confined. Like I will never be able to do this outside that. And there is like, you know, autistic students prefer routines, but when it's that forced, you know, nobody likes that. Like there's no student that likes to be forced into a conversation. And outside of that, you're just done, right? Like once the hour session ends, it's over, right? And I think that's what Uskari at least has told me, like, yeah, I don't really enjoy that. I don't like that at all. But yeah, one thing that, you know, we've tried to do is we call every week at 9 p.m., but there's never a time limit on when that ends. So he knows that the call will start at 9, but he likes the fact that we can talk on and on until he gets bored and he's just like, yeah, I don't want to talk anymore. It's time for me to go to bed. And he likes that setting a lot more because it's like free flowing, right? Like he can talk about as much as he wants to, and I can even talk about as much as I want to until we're both like, okay, I think that's enough for the week. I think we've talked about enough of the week and we're okay now. Yeah.
I have a question. I was just curious, and thank you for your presentation. It was really enlightening. And I did also like the language piece. And it's a good reminder that language is ever evolving as well. But my question to you actually has to do with the bilingualism. And I was just curious if you've worked with other bilingual schools. I think something I think about is that at a bilingual school, there's already like co-teaching happening. There's already this layer of stuff happening that is more than other schools. So I wonder, have you worked with other bilingual schools or other bilingual kids in this setting? And like, you know, are there kind of like extra tips in terms of like being an ally and making sure those kids are seen and heard? I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. And I'll be frank, no, this is actually the only bilingual school that we work with. Elodie, I think, really reached out to me, what, 2 years ago, maybe?
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago. And it was on a complete whim. I honestly didn't know that we would work so well together. So it's been really nice. But what would I say, I guess, are some tips? I think especially what I've started to recognize in general, I mean, you know, in the Bay Area, we end up having like a lot of bilingual students because it's very, very diverse. They often have language preferences, like students have language preferences that they would prefer. And it sometimes can be an additional kind of obstacle to really connect. For example, Uskari would speak in Urdu quite a bit. So, and I understand Hindi, which is pretty close, but I can't speak Hindi. I can't converse in Hindi. So it was kind of like that barrier of us trying to cross of like, how do we communicate? So I guess that is something to consider. I wish I had more experience in the domain for sure. I think, you know, I could provide more advice, but I'm sure that, you know, the more experience that I have working with EB and maybe even more schools in the future, I could provide like a concrete list of things. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that adds to the interaction and kind of considering of how to connect with the student for sure.
If I may, like having being like a specialized teacher, like in France and like with my background, and when I moved at EB, I felt like the co-teaching that you were talking about, or a lot of things, I was like, oh, since I arrived in a bilingual school, I was, okay, it's kind of like, I see a lot of similarities with my training as a specialized teacher, because you could connect with a lot of things. Like, for example, the core, like the programs, the curriculum, like for the kids, you really have to explicit for kids with like that they need to understand that they have different learning. So you really focus when you are trained to be a teacher for neurodiverse students, you really focus on being very explicit, on having very explicit concept, and you really detach the concept and the way you're gonna take to reach the goal. And I feel when I arrive also in a bilingual school, it's the same thing. Like you have the barrier is the language sometimes, or the language could be the support. And it's kind of the same thing with like the difference learning. They could sometimes be a barrier, but sometimes they could be a support. So you find out a lot of similarities. It's kind of cool to look at both of them, because yeah, it's a lot. We use the same also, like the diversity. We want to include you. It's a lot like about all you learn. So everything got together. it's like a puzzle.
I have one more question.
Of
And this is
course.
actually just personal about you. I mean, I, for one, just feel so good that young people like yourself are just so engaged and thoughtful and caring, especially as a neurotypical learner, that sort of this is your field of interest. And my question is, I'm just so curious about what you'll be studying or what you'd like to study when you go off to college in the fall.
Yes, of course. So I've actually had a lot of personal battles with this, definitely. Just trying to figure out what, like what domain do I want to go into? I struggled for a very long time between education and medicine. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so education and medicine was something that I kind of battled for a very long time of like what I wanted to choose between. I don't think I've really come to a consensus even now. But I definitely want to go, or what I applied for in November when I did is neuroscience. So hopefully that lends itself to psychiatry at some point in the future. Maybe not, I don't know. But my initial plans were to be like a neuropsychiatrist. So a little bit in everything. I guess what the summary was, I was deciding mainly between neurodegenerative disease, so Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and that type of domain versus neurodevelopment, so autism, ADHD, and also just younger children in general. So yeah, I haven't really chosen. I don't know yet, but it's definitely something with the brain.
Any more questions for Aaryan? Well, listen, I think what you're doing is wonderful. You're really an impressive guy, and
thank you so much.
I'm excited of all the things that you're going to accomplish going forward. And what you've accomplished so far. And we definitely want to stay in touch with you.
Of course.
And follow your future, and hopefully you can help us out in some of our future conversations that we have, because we try and do this a few times a year with this group at EB. If there's no more questions for Aaryan, we did record this for some of you people who came in a little bit later, and we'll share that once it's uploaded. Thank you very much. Great talk, super interesting. And this is your opportunity to plug your podcast and your foundation, because I'm sure that you would like more listeners and more people who are engaged with your organization. So fire away.
Yes, of course. I appreciate it. So the podcast name is Neurodiversity in a Nutshell. Should be pretty easy to find. It's on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts, it'll be there. I promise you. We are nearing, I think, 40 episodes. So those are kind of rolling around. Some of them are scheduled to come out in the coming weeks. The website for my organization is www.unitopia.foundation. Foundation is the domain. Instead of like the natural .com or .org, it's .foundation. And if you want to email me, it's founder@unitopia.foundation. So founder@website. If you want to email to get involved, it's publicrelations@unitopia.foundation. So publicrelations@website. Yeah, so those are all the relevant links. You can find me however. If you struggle to find it somehow, you can reach out to Elodie and she can definitely get you in contact with me. But I'm really excited to work with all of you guys in the future. Yeah.
Or go to the Learning Different Support Group resource page. There's a link there, not only to your podcast, but to the site as well. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Round of applause for Aaryan. And we hope to have you join us again soon. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Thank you.
Care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.